Inside the Glenn H. Curtiss Museum in New York stands a Curtiss P-40N Warhawk that appears complete. Its wings are straight, its tail is in place, an Allison engine fills the nose. From a distance, it looks like an aircraft that survived the war, passed through storage, and eventually reached a museum. That is not what happened. One of the wrecks used to create this airplane was estimated by the museum to have been nearly 90% complete when it was found in a Florida swamp. Yet the finished display could not be built from that wreck alone. It eventually required material from 3 separate P-40s, original factory drawings, extensive new fabrication, and years of work. The reason lies in a difference that recovery teams learn quickly. A part can still exist without being usable. A wing can remain recognizable while its internal structure is too damaged to support its own shape. A fuselage can look almost complete while corrosion, distortion, and impact damage have turned it into evidence rather than an airframe. The story of this Warhawk, therefore, begins long before the museum and long before the recovery boats. It begins on the morning of March 24, 1945, when 4 P-40s left Perry Army Airfield in northern Florida for a formation training flight. The aircraft belonged to the 342nd Army Air Force Base Unit. Among the pilots were Flight Officer Earl R. Goodyear, flying P-40N serial 43-24362, and Second Lieutenant Roy C. Rom, flying serial 44-7305. They were not on a combat mission. They were practicing close formation work, a task that depended on position, speed, and spacing. During any turn, each pilot had to adjust while watching the other airplanes and preserving enough room to avoid contact. During a left turn, the 2 P-40s collided. The exact geometry of those seconds is not fully documented in the sources available today, and it should not be reconstructed more confidently than the evidence allows. What is clear is the result. The collision tore the tail from one aircraft and left the other with severe structural damage. Roy Rom managed to leave his airplane by parachute. He survived but was injured. Earl Goodyear did not escape. He was killed. Both aircraft fell into wetlands near the Suwannee River, roughly 18 miles inland from the Gulf of Mexico. The wrecks came down about half a mile apart. There was no major post-crash fire. Large sections of both aircraft remained at the 2 sites. Military personnel reached the area, recovered Goodyear's body, and classified the 2 P-40s as total losses. Recovering badly damaged training aircraft from remote wetlands offered little practical return. The people left. Most of the airplanes remained. For the next 4 decades, water, mud, and vegetation concealed more of the wreckage. Corrosion continued. Damage created in the collision remained locked into bent panels, broken joints, and distorted structures. Some sections stayed recognizable. Others disappeared beneath the surface. The swamp did not affect every part in the same way. Material exposed to water and air deteriorated. Parts buried more deeply could become sealed inside dense mud. That did not preserve them perfectly, but it sometimes protected internal surfaces better than those left exposed. The Allison engine showed this contrast most clearly. It had driven deep into the wet ground and eventually lay about 10 feet beneath water and mud. Its outer castings were cracked and damaged. Inside, however, some components survived in better condition because the packed mud around the engine limited movement and exposure. By the middle of the 1980s, the 2 P-40s were no longer aircraft in any practical sense. They were scattered wreck sites. Their components lay at different depths and in different conditions. Some sections could be identified easily. Others were buried, distorted, or hidden by the site itself. That was the situation Hal Thompson encountered when he located the wrecks and began organizing their recovery around 1986. The greatest obstacle was access. There was no convenient road to the site. A truck could not be backed up beside the fuselage. A trailer could not be brought under a wing. Heavy equipment could not simply drive into position. Between the wrecks and usable road access lay nearly 6 miles of swamp. The two aircraft had fallen about half a mile apart, so the operation involved two separate wreck sites rather than one concentrated airframe. No surviving public account documents every tool, every lift, or every decision made at the site. What the museum record does establish is the scale of the operation. The aircraft were dismantled in the swamp, their parts were moved by boat, the route to the road was measured in miles, not yards. The work extended from the middle of the 1980s across roughly 2 years. That distance determined the recovery method. The team could not treat either P-40 as a single object. The aircraft had to be separated into sections that could be handled in the water, loaded into boats, and moved out through the wetlands. Removing a part from the site was therefore only one stage of the work. Each recovered section then had to complete the long boat journey to the point where ordinary road transport became possible. The available photographs show the result more clearly than any detailed written account of the procedure. Large pieces of airframe were brought out separately. Fuselage sections, wing material, tail components, panels, fittings, and smaller parts accumulated outside the swamp. The recovery extended across more than one season, turning two crash sites into a growing collection of aircraft structure. The work was slow because the wreckage did not survive as a single uniform object. One section might still retain its outline, another could be badly bent or broken. Some parts had remained near the surface, others had sunk much deeper. The team had to recover what the site would release and transport it in loads small enough for the route out. There was no single dramatic moment when a complete Warhawk rose from the water. The airplane emerged in pieces. A section would arrive outside the swamp stained by water and mud. It could then be examined, photographed, stored, or prepared for display. With each trip, the collection became larger. Yet the original shape of the aircraft became harder to see, because the wreck had to be divided before it could be saved. The number of trips mattered because the recovered material ranged from large airframe sections to small components whose value was not obvious until they could be cleaned and compared. A complete restoration would eventually need both. The large pieces preserved the outline of the airplane. The smaller fittings, brackets, panels, and internal parts preserved details that factory drawings alone could not always show as clearly as original metal. The operation also produced a visual record. Photographs retained by the museum show the wreckage, the engine, separated components, and stages of the recovery. Years later, those images would become part of the evidence connecting a museum airframe in New York to two abandoned crash sites in Florida. By the time the last major material had been removed, the project no longer resembled a conventional salvage. There was no single airframe waiting at the end of the route. There were groups of components, each carrying a different amount of damage, corrosion, and historical information. The recovery had succeeded in saving a large quantity of original material, but it had also revealed how much reconstruction would be required before that material could again form the shape of a P-40. This distinction matters. A recovery can preserve material without preserving the arrangement in which that material once worked. Removing a fuselage section, a wing panel, and a landing gear fitting does not automatically preserve the precise relationships between them. Once the wrecks had been dismantled and carried out, the future restoration would have to reconstruct those relationships from surviving parts, measurements, and drawings. The engine was the heaviest and most deeply buried part of the operation. It was found roughly 10 feet beneath water and mud. Bringing it out required the recovery team to reach a component that had sunk much farther than the visible airframe. By the time the Allison V-1710 was recovered, its outer castings showed cracks and impact damage, while some of the components sealed inside had survived in noticeably better condition. That contrast made the engine valuable, even though it could never return to flight. It carried direct physical evidence of the crash, the burial, and the decades beneath the swamp. It could also become the central mechanical component of a future static display. Once recovered, the engine faced the same practical problem as every other major section. It still had to be taken from the isolated site to the road. Only after leaving the wetlands could it join the rest of the material already gathered from the two aircraft. By the end of the recovery, the project seemed to have achieved something extraordinary. One of the airframes was estimated by the museum to have been nearly 90% complete when found. Major sections had been recovered. The engine had been brought up from deep beneath the mud. Large quantities of original material were now outside the swamp. But a recovered collection is not the same thing as a restorable airplane. That difference became visible when the components could be laid out and examined away from the water. An archival photograph from 1991 shows the forward fuselage of a recovered P-40 on a trailer during an aviation gathering at Lakeland, Florida. The engine compartment is open. The metal is stained and deformed. Nearby, a display board presents photographs of the swamp recovery. The image is important because it shows completeness and damage at the same time. Much of the aircraft was present. Very little of it was ready to be joined together. The trailer captured an intermediate state that a finished display would later hide. The wreckage had left the swamp, but it had not yet become a restoration. Open spaces remained where systems and structure should have been, and the damage showed why a simple reassembly was no longer realistic. An airplane's structure depends on alignment. Skins, frames, ribs, spars, and fittings support one another. If a large section has twisted, replacing one broken piece does not automatically restore the original geometry. If corrosion has thinned material around a joint, the visible panel may remain, while the connection behind it has lost its strength. This was especially serious in the wings and tail. These were broad, relatively thin structures assembled from many parts that had to meet at precise angles. Some original pieces remained useful as references, others could be preserved as artifacts, but many could not safely serve as the foundation of a complete display aircraft. The wreck could be nearly complete as an inventory of parts while remaining far from complete as an airplane. That was the central problem. The recovery had saved the material, but it had not reversed the crash or the decades underwater. Cleaning the parts would not be enough. Bolting them together would not be enough. A future restoration would have to decide which pieces could remain, which required reinforcement, which could only be used as patterns, and which had to be replaced. During the years that followed, the wreckage passed through several owners and locations. Some assemblies were repaired or strengthened. The project appeared at aviation events and continued to attract interest, but it still did not become a complete Warhawk. The material then passed through owners in Ohio and Iowa. During those years, some parts were repaired, reinforced, or prepared for later use, but the central problem remained unchanged. The project possessed a remarkable quantity of original wreckage, without possessing a complete structure capable of holding the final airplane together. That long period between recovery and museum acquisition is important. The aircraft did not travel directly from the swamp to a finished gallery. It spent years as an unfinished collection, whose future depended on finding an institution willing to treat it as both an artifact and a reconstruction project. In August of 2011, the Glenn H. Curtiss Museum acquired the project. The museum did not receive one complete airframe with a simple continuous identity. It received material from the 2 Florida wrecks, additional parts from a third P-40 wreck recovered in Georgia, an Allison engine, damaged assemblies, repaired sections, and many separate components. The goal was not to build an aircraft that could fly. The museum intended to create an accurate static display, with selected controls, lights, and landing gear functions operating for educational use. The restoration shop began by sorting and identifying what had survived. Original parts were cleaned and studied. Some could be installed. Some were too fragile or distorted to carry the new structure, but could still provide dimensions, shapes, and connection points. Other pieces showed how Curtiss had formed, drilled, and assembled the airplane, even when the pieces themselves could not be reused. Factory drawings from Curtiss-Wright became essential. The wreckage showed what remained. The drawings showed where every part was supposed to be. The museum had to preserve the history of the wreckage without allowing damaged material to dictate the shape of the final airplane. The surviving components became more than parts to be installed. They were references. Hole patterns, bends, fittings, and original construction details could be compared with the factory drawings. Where the wreckage and the drawings agreed, the restorers gained confidence in the geometry. Where damage had altered a piece, the drawings provided the baseline needed to rebuild it. This was one reason material from a third P-40 mattered. The Georgia wreck did not transform the project into a complete original aircraft. It provided additional pieces and references where the two Florida machines had left gaps. The final display would therefore represent a type and a recovery story rather than the untouched survival of one serial number. This was particularly important in rebuilding the wings. Many original wing components had survived only as damaged references. The restorers could not simply straighten them and close the skins. They had to recreate the correct shape around a jig. The jig was not part of the airplane. It was an external framework that held surviving and newly made components in the proper positions while the wing was assembled. Without it, small errors could accumulate from one part to the next until the completed wing no longer matched the original design. Inside the jig, original pieces and newly fabricated parts could be checked against factory dimensions. New structure replaced sections that had lost too much material or shape. Recoverable fittings and fragments were incorporated where practical. Damaged originals that could not return to use still guided the reconstruction. The tail required similar judgment. So did the fuselage, engine installation, control systems, and landing gear. The work was not a contest to maximize a single percentage of original metal. It was a series of decisions about historical value, appearance, stability, and accuracy. The museum also chose not to make every surviving surface look new. Where original material could remain, the marks of corrosion, recovery, and age formed part of the aircraft's history. The display was not intended to pretend that every component had left the Curtiss factory together. That was impossible. The airplane had one final shape, but its material history came from several machines. Gradually, the scattered components began to form recognizable lines. The long nose closed around the Allison engine. The rebuilt wings extended from the fuselage. The tail returned. Controls, lights, and landing gear mechanisms were prepared for display. Parts that had traveled by boat through a Florida swamp now sat beside newly fabricated structure built from wartime drawings. The project had crossed a boundary. Recovery had saved what remained. Restoration decided what those remains could become. Today, the museum's reconstructed P-40N stands on display. It is not a combat veteran preserved exactly as it landed, and it is not one swamp wreck returned intact to the air. It is a static reconstruction built around genuine survivors from multiple aircraft. The Allison engine and original structural pieces connect it directly to the wrecks recovered in Florida. New material gives those parts the alignment and support they no longer possessed. Components from a third wreck fill gaps that the two collision aircraft could not. The swamp did not return a ready-made Warhawk. It returned an engine buried deep in mud, recognizable sections of airframe, damaged fittings, broken structures, and enough evidence to show what the aircraft had once been. Each recovered section first had to cross nearly 6 miles of wet ground and dark water. Then the collection had to survive years of movement, storage, assessment, and repair. Finally, restorers had to rebuild the geometry that the collision and the swamp had erased. Nearly 90% may have been there. But presence was only the beginning. The swamp preserved the pieces of a Warhawk. It took 3 wrecks and years of reconstruction to make them look like an airplane again.